Victorian England, 1863. The grand spring ball at Pemberton Palace sparkled with the light of 1,000 candles, illuminating the cream of London society. Ladies in billowing silk gowns fluttered like exotic birds across the polished ballroom floor, their laughter mingling with the sweet notes of the orchestra. Yet in this sea of carefully orchestrated beauty, Lady Helen Ashford stood apart. "Do straighten your posture, dear," whispered Lady Caroline Ashford, her mother, with a gentle pat on her daughter's arm, and perhaps a smile would not go amiss. Helen obliged with a practiced curve of her lips that never quite reached her eyes. At 23, she had endured 5 seasons of balls, soirees, and garden parties, each one reinforcing what she already knew. She was not what society considered a prize. The fashionable silhouette demanded a willowy frame, while Helen possessed what her mother charitably called a robust constitution. Her figure, fuller than the current style demanded, became the subject of whispered comments behind fluttering fans. "I believe I shall take some air, Mother," Helen murmured, smoothing the emerald silk of her gown. "But Lord Fairchild's son has only just arrived," her mother protested. "Your father says he has excellent prospects, and I'm certain he'll find a suitable match before supper is announced," Helen replied, with a gentle firmness that brooked no argument. As she navigated the perimeter of the ballroom, Helen felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling over her shoulders like an unwelcome shawl. Her father, the Earl of Westbrook, had been unusually quiet on the carriage ride to Pemberton Palace. She had caught the concerned glances between her parents, another season passing, their only daughter still unwed, their hopes dimming with each declined invitation to dance. Helen found refuge in a relatively quiet alcove, partially concealed by a potted palm. From this vantage point, she observed the elegant choreography of society at play. Young debutantes with narrow waists and practiced giggles circled prospective suitors like delicate butterflies. Matrons with calculating eyes evaluated potential matches, measuring worth in acres and annual incomes. "You appear to be cataloguing the follies of mankind with remarkable attention to detail, Lady Helen." The deep voice startled her from her observations. She turned to find herself facing a tall figure dressed in impeccable evening attire. Even had he not spoken, Helen would have recognized Vincent Hastings, the Duke of Ashbourne. His reputation preceded him like a shadow, brilliant in business, merciless to rivals, and possessing a fortune that made even the most established families take notice. "Your Grace," Helen curtsied, hoping her surprise wasn't evident. "I was merely taking a moment's respite from the festivities." "A diplomatic answer," he remarked, his piercing grey eyes studying her with unexpected intensity. "Though I suspect you were contemplating how quickly you might escape without causing offence to your parents." Helen felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "You presume to know my thoughts remarkably well for someone with whom I've exchanged perhaps 10 words in all our previous encounters." A smile played at the corner of his mouth, not the practiced social smile she had seen him employ with others, but something more genuine. "Forgive me. I only meant to suggest that you seem as enthused about these proceedings as I typically am." The orchestra began the opening notes of a waltz, and couples moved toward the center of the ballroom. "One waltz with me, Lady Helen," the Duke said suddenly, "and you'll be my wife." Helen blinked, then let out a startled laugh. "My goodness, Your Grace, what a peculiar jest." "Is it?" His expression remained inscrutable, his hand extended toward her in invitation. "Surely you cannot be serious," Helen replied, glancing around to see if others were witnessing this strange exchange. "Perhaps I am. Perhaps I'm not," he answered, his eyes glinting with something she couldn't quite identify. "Does it matter? It's only a dance, after all." Something in his challenge awakened a spark of defiance in Helen. All evening she had been overlooked, dismissed by gentlemen seeking prettier, wealthier, more conventional partners. What harm could there be in one dance, even if the partner was the infamous Duke of Ashbourne? "Very well," she placed her hand in his. "Though I warn you, Your Grace, I may tread upon your toes. I'm not known for my grace on the dance floor." "I shall consider myself warned," he replied, leading her toward the center of the ballroom. As they took their positions, Helen became acutely aware of the curious glances directed their way. The Duke of Ashbourne rarely danced, and never with someone like her, a lady of good family but unremarkable beauty, with no exceptional dowry to recommend her. His hand at her waist was firm but respectful, as they began to move in time with the music. Helen had expected awkwardness, but found instead that they moved together with surprising ease. "You lied about your dancing abilities, Lady Helen," the Duke observed, after a particularly smooth turn. "Perhaps I merely wished to lower expectations," she countered. "A strategic approach," he nodded, the ghost of a smile appearing again, though unnecessary in this instance. As they continued to dance, Helen found herself studying the Duke's face, handsome in a severe way, with features that spoke of determination rather than classical beauty. His reputation for ruthlessness seemed at odds with the careful way he guided her through the steps of the waltz. "May I inquire as to why you singled me out this evening?" Helen asked, curiosity overcoming propriety. "Surely there are ladies present more suited to your station." "More suited?" He raised an eyebrow. "You're the daughter of an earl." "You know precisely what I mean," Helen replied, her voice low but firm. "I am not the sort of lady gentlemen typically seek as partners, either for a dance or for life." The Duke's eyes met hers with unexpected directness. "Perhaps that is precisely why I find you interesting, Lady Helen. You appear to be the only person in this room who isn't performing for an audience." Before she could formulate a response, the music drew to a close. Helen prepared to curtsy and make her retreat, but found her hand still firmly held in the Duke's grasp. "I believe I should return you to your mother," he said, but instead of leading her to the sidelines, he guided her to the very center of the ballroom. The master of ceremonies tapped his staff against the floor, a signal for attention. Conversations hushed as faces turned toward them. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Duke of Ashbourne's voice carried effortlessly across the now silent ballroom, "I am pleased to announce that this lovely lady has done me the honor of accepting my proposal. I present to you my fiancée, the future Duchess of Ashbourne, Lady Helen Ashford." Helen's world tilted on its axis. Surely she had misheard. This couldn't possibly be happening. "No, no, he is jesting," she protested, her voice barely audible over the sudden outbreak of gasps and murmurs. The Duke leaned close, his smile never wavering as he whispered, "She's merely overcome with emotion. Weren't expecting me to announce it quite so publicly, were you, my dear?" Before Helen could gather her wits to respond, her parents appeared beside them. Her father's face was alight with astonishment and delight, while her mother appeared on the verge of happy tears. "Your Grace, this is— we had no idea," the Earl of Westbrook stammered, clasping the Duke's hand with both of his own. "We are honored, truly honored." "Helen, darling," her mother embraced her, voice trembling with emotion. "Why didn't you tell us? Oh, what wonderful news." Around them, the ballroom had erupted into a buzz of conversation. Helen caught fragments of shocked whispers. How had plain Lady Helen secured the most eligible duke in England? What could he possibly see in her? Was there some scandal necessitating such a hasty engagement? "I think," said the Duke, smoothly inserting himself between Helen and the growing crowd, "that Lady Helen and I should step onto the terrace for a moment. The excitement appears to have overcome her." Without waiting for a response, he guided her through the French doors and into the cool night air of the terrace. The moment they were alone, Helen rounded on him. "Have you taken leave of your senses? What possessed you to make such an announcement?" Her voice shook with a mixture of anger and disbelief. The Duke's composed facade slipped for the first time that evening, revealing a flash of what appeared to be genuine confusion. "I must confess, Lady Helen, I did not expect you to accept my invitation to dance. When you did—" He paused, seeming to search for words, a novelty for a man known for his commanding presence. "I suppose I allowed the jest to carry further than intended." "A jest?" Helen's hands clenched at her sides. "You've announced our engagement to all of society as a jest." "I assure you it was not premeditated," he replied, his composure returning. "But now that it's done, perhaps we should consider the advantages." Advantages? What possible advantage could there be in this farce? The Duke leaned against the stone balustrade, studying her with those penetrating grey eyes. "You gain a husband of considerable means and influence. I gain a wife who, unlike most of the simpering debutantes in that ballroom, appears to possess both intelligence and character. It seems a fair exchange." Helen stared at him in disbelief. "You cannot possibly be suggesting we proceed with this charade. And what would you suggest instead? Shall we return inside and announce that it was all a misunderstanding?" Consider the consequences, Lady Helen. Your reputation would be in tatters. Your parents' disappointment would be profound. A disappointment engineered entirely by you, Helen pointed out, struggling to keep her voice steady. A shadow passed across the Duke's face. Perhaps. But the fact remains that we find ourselves in this situation nonetheless. He straightened, adjusting his already immaculate cuffs. I propose a compromise. We maintain the engagement for a period of 3 months. During that time, we will become better acquainted. If at the end of that period you find the prospect of marriage to me utterly intolerable, I will take full responsibility for breaking the engagement. Helen regarded him with suspicion. And why would you agree to such terms? What do you gain from this arrangement? For a moment, the Duke's expression softened into something almost vulnerable. Perhaps I simply find you interesting, Lady Helen. Is that so difficult to believe? Before she could respond, the terrace doors opened and her parents emerged, followed by several curious onlookers. "There you are!" her mother exclaimed. "Everyone is waiting to congratulate you both." The Duke offered his arm to Helen, his expression once again unreadable. "Shall we, my dear? Our audience awaits." With the weight of expectation pressing down upon her and no viable escape presenting itself, Helen placed her hand on his arm. As they stepped back into the blazing lights of the ballroom, she wondered what twist of fate had led her to this moment, and where this unexpected path might lead. 2 weeks later, Greystone Abbey rose from the misty Hampshire countryside like something from a Gothic novel, all imposing stone and ancient dignity. As the carriage bearing Helen and her lady's maid Clara wound its way up the long drive, Helen studied what was to be her future home, with a mixture of apprehension and reluctant fascination. "It's like something from a dream, milady," Clara whispered, her nose practically pressed to the carriage window. "Or perhaps a ghost story." "Let us hope it's the former rather than the latter," Helen replied, adjusting her bonnet nervously. This would be her first visit to the Duke's ancestral home, a proper introduction to the life that awaited her, should this strange engagement reach its intended conclusion. The past fortnight had passed in a blur of activity. News of the engagement had spread through London society like wildfire. Helen had found herself transformed overnight from an overlooked wallflower to the subject of intense scrutiny and speculation. Ladies who had previously barely acknowledged her existence now called upon her mother daily, fishing for details of the courtship that had seemingly materialized from thin air. The Duke, meanwhile, had performed his role as devoted fiancé with surprising dedication. He had called upon her daily, bringing thoughtful gifts that displayed an unexpected understanding of her interests, rare books of poetry, botanical illustrations, even a small telescope after she had mentioned a childhood fascination with astronomy. Yet despite his attentions, Helen remained wary. She had caught glimpses of a different man behind the polished facade, moments of genuine wit, flashes of vulnerability quickly masked. But could she truly trust someone who had entangled her in this charade to begin with? The carriage rolled to a stop before the grand entrance. Helen took a steadying breath as a footman opened the door and offered his hand to help her descend. The Duke stood waiting at the top of the stone steps, dressed more casually than she had yet seen him in a well-tailored riding coat and buckskin breeches. The country setting seemed to suit him. He appeared more at ease here than in London's ballrooms. "Lady Helen," he bowed slightly, taking her hand, "welcome to Greystone Abbey." "Your Grace," she curtsied, acutely aware of the servants' curious glances. "Thank you for the invitation." "Vincent, please," he corrected, offering his arm. "If we are to maintain this charade convincingly, you might as well use my given name." Helen hesitated only momentarily before placing her hand on his sleeve. "Very well, Vincent, though I must confess it feels rather improper." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I suspect we left propriety behind the moment I announced our engagement at Pemberton Palace." He led her through the massive oak doors into a soaring entrance hall. Despite the grandeur of the architecture, with its vaulted ceilings and ancient tapestries, the interior was surprisingly warm and welcoming. "Mrs. Harrington, my housekeeper," Vincent introduced a stately woman who approached with a respectful curtsy. "She will show you to your chambers. I thought you might appreciate some time to refresh yourself after your journey." "That would be most welcome," Helen agreed, suddenly conscious of the dust from the road that clung to her traveling costume. "Excellent. Luncheon will be served at 1 o'clock in the morning room," Vincent said. Afterward, if you're amenable, I thought I might show you the grounds. As Helen followed Mrs. Harrington up the grand staircase, she couldn't help but wonder at the Duke's solicitousness. If this was merely a performance for the benefit of his staff, it was remarkably convincing. Her chambers proved to be a delightful suite overlooking the rose garden. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the elegant but comfortable furnishings. Clara had already begun unpacking her trunks under the supervision of a young housemaid assigned to assist them. "His Grace had the rooms redecorated, my lady," Mrs. Harrington informed her with obvious pride. "The Duchess's suite has not been used since his mother's passing, but the Duke was most insistent that it be prepared for your arrival." Helen felt a pang of something indefinable at this information. "It's beautiful," she said sincerely. "Please convey my appreciation to His Grace." After Mrs. Harrington departed, Clara helped Helen change into a fresh day dress of lavender muslin. As her maid arranged her hair in a simpler style appropriate for the country, Helen found herself studying her reflection in the dressing-table mirror. "What am I doing here, Clara?" she asked softly. Clara met her gaze in the mirror. "If I may speak freely, milady." "Always." "I think you're giving yourself a chance." Clara secured a final pin in Helen's chignon. "Whether this peculiar arrangement leads to marriage or not, you're allowing yourself to be seen, truly seen, perhaps, for the first time." Helen considered this as she made her way downstairs for luncheon. The morning room proved to be another pleasant surprise. Less formal than she had expected, with comfortable furnishings and windows that opened onto a view of the kitchen gardens. Vincent rose as she entered. "I hope your chambers are to your liking." "Very much so," Helen replied, taking the seat a footman held for her. "I understand you went to considerable trouble to have them prepared." "Not at all." He waved a dismissive hand, though a hint of colour touched his cheekbones. "It seemed only fitting that my future Duchess should have appropriate accommodations." They dined on cold fowl, fresh bread, and early summer strawberries. To Helen's surprise, the conversation flowed naturally. Vincent inquired about her journey and spoke knowledgeably about the book of poetry he had sent the previous week. "I must confess," she said as they finished their meal, "I find it difficult to reconcile the man before me with the ruthless businessman I've heard described in London drawing rooms." Vincent's expression shuttered briefly before he replied, "Perhaps both versions contain elements of truth. Business requires a certain resoluteness that personal relationships do not." "And which version am I experiencing now?" Helen asked boldly. His grey eyes met hers with unexpected candour. "I'm not entirely certain myself, Lady Helen. This situation between us has taken me into uncharted waters." Before Helen could pursue this intriguing admission, they were interrupted by a footman announcing the arrival of unexpected visitors. "Lady Sophia Blackwood and Mrs. Penelope Crawford, Your Grace." Vincent's expression darkened momentarily. "Show them to the blue drawing room. We shall join them shortly." Once the footman had departed, Vincent sighed. "I apologize for the interruption. Lady Sophia is my godmother's daughter and has taken it upon herself to guide me in social matters since my return from abroad." "I see," Helen said carefully, noting the tension that had entered his bearing. "Should I be concerned?" "Only if you dislike excessive flattery concealing thinly veiled interrogation," he replied dryly, standing to offer his arm. "Shall we face the Inquisition together?" The blue drawing room contained two elegantly dressed visitors. The younger, whom Helen immediately identified as Lady Sophia, possessed the kind of classical beauty that turned heads in any gathering: golden hair, perfect features, and a willowy figure currently draped in expensive French silk. The older woman, presumably Mrs. Crawford, had the sharp-eyed look of someone who missed nothing. "Vincent, darling," Lady Sophia rose in a flutter of azure fabric, extending her hands. "We simply couldn't wait for a formal invitation to meet your bride-to-be." The slight pause before bride-to-be spoke volumes. Vincent took her hands briefly before stepping back. "Lady Sophia, Mrs. Crawford, may I present Lady Helen Ashford, daughter of the Earl of Westbrook?" Helen curtsied politely. "I'm pleased to make your acquaintance." "Lady Helen," Lady Sophia's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "What a surprise your engagement has been to us all. Vincent has always been so particular about his associations." "A quality I continue to maintain," Vincent replied smoothly, guiding Helen to a settee and taking a seat beside her. Which is why I'm certain you'll understand that we had planned a quiet afternoon. Perhaps we might arrange for you to call another day." Mrs. Crawford gave a thin smile. "Now, Your Grace, we've travelled all this way. Surely you can spare a few moments to satisfy an old friend's curiosity." She turned her penetrating gaze to Helen. "The announcement was so sudden. One cannot help but wonder at the circumstances." "The circumstances are quite simple," Vincent replied before Helen could respond. "I met a woman of intelligence and character and decided she would make an excellent duchess." "How practical of you," Lady Sophia said with a tinkling laugh. Though one usually expects a certain compatibility in such arrangements, shared connections, similar backgrounds, she gave Helen an assessing glance that took in every inch of her unfashionably curvaceous figure. Common interests. Helen felt her cheeks warm, but Vincent's hand covered hers before she could respond. "I find that true compatibility often reveals itself in unexpected places," he said, his tone pleasant but firm. "Helen and I share a refreshing frankness that I value considerably more than shared connections in London ballrooms." Mrs. Crawford leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. "There are rumours, of course. Some suggest the hasty nature of the engagement might indicate particular circumstances." Helen stiffened at the implication, but Vincent's laugh cut through the tension. "If you're asking whether Lady Helen is with child, I can assure you that is not the case. Our engagement, while perhaps unexpected to society at large, is based solely on mutual regard." "How reassuring," Lady Sophia said, though her expression suggested she was anything but reassured. "Though one wonders why there was no proper courtship, no announcement in the papers until after that dramatic scene at Pemberton Palace." Helen found her voice at last. "His Grace and I preferred to keep our acquaintance private until we were certain of our feelings." The lie came more easily than she had expected. The announcement at the ball was perhaps more exuberant than we had planned, but sincere nonetheless. Vincent's eyes flicked to her face, something like admiration flickering in their depths. "Well," Mrs. Crawford sniffed, clearly dissatisfied with this explanation, "I do hope you understand the responsibility of the position you're assuming, Lady Helen. The Duchess of Ashbourne must uphold certain standards. The management of estates like Greystone requires experience, connections, and, of course, appropriate bearing." "I have every confidence in Helen's abilities," Vincent said firmly. "Now, ladies, I'm afraid we must cut this visit short. We have matters to discuss regarding the wedding arrangements." After a flurry of insincere expressions of delight at making Helen's acquaintance and promises to call again soon, the visitors were finally ushered out. Vincent returned to the drawing room to find Helen standing by the window, her posture rigid. "I apologize for that intrusion," he said quietly. "Lady Sophia has harbored certain expectations regarding her position in my life for some time." Helen turned to face him. She hoped to be Duchess. It wasn't a question, but Vincent nodded. "Her mother and my godmother have been orchestrating that outcome since we were children. I have never encouraged those hopes, but neither have I definitively extinguished them until now." "I see." Helen studied him thoughtfully. "That explains her hostility, but not yours. You seem to anticipate their visit with something like dread." Vincent's expression shuttered again, but after a moment's hesitation he replied, "Lady Sophia represents a world I have increasingly come to find hollow, a society that values appearances above substance, connections above character. And yet you move within that world with apparent ease. Necessity often requires us to wear masks, Lady Helen." He gestured toward the window. "Shall we continue with our original plan? The gardens are particularly pleasant this time of year." As they walked among the blooming roses, Helen found herself revisiting their encounter with Lady Sophia. "She is exceptionally beautiful," she observed, testing his reaction. "Conventionally so," Vincent agreed without enthusiasm. "Beauty is common enough in society. What I find far more rare is honesty." "Is that what attracted you to me?" Helen asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "My honesty?" Vincent paused beside a particularly vibrant crimson rose. "You challenged me from our first conversation. You did not feign interest in my title or fortune. You questioned my motives rather than accepting my attention as your due." He reached out to touch a perfect bloom. "In a world of carefully cultivated hothouse flowers, you are a wild rose, authentic and unafraid to show your thorns." The unexpected poetry of his response left Helen momentarily speechless. "I'm not certain that's a compliment," she finally managed. The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "It is perhaps the highest compliment I am capable of giving." They continued their walk in companionable silence, eventually reaching a small, ornamental lake. A stone bench provided a perfect vantage point to observe the tranquil water. "May I ask you something, Vincent?" Helen said as they sat. "You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough." She gathered her courage. "Why did you really announce our engagement that night? The truth, please." Vincent was quiet for so long that Helen thought he might invoke his right not to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I have spent my adult life building walls between myself and others. That evening, watching you observe the ballroom with such clear-eyed assessment of its absurdities, I recognized something of myself in you." He turned to face her, his expression more open than she had yet seen it. "When I approached you, I expected the same flattery and deference I received from everyone else. Instead, you met me as an equal, wary perhaps, but genuine." "That doesn't explain the public announcement," Helen pressed gently. Vincent ran a hand through his hair, the first truly unguarded gesture she had witnessed from him. "When you accepted my invitation to dance, something shifted. I found myself wondering what it would be like to have someone like you by my side, someone who would not simply agree with everything I said, someone who would see the man behind the title. So you claimed me like a prize at a country fair." Helen couldn't keep a note of indignation from her voice. "I acted impulsively," he admitted, surprising her. "It was uncharacteristic. I have built my reputation on careful calculation, yet in that moment—" He shook his head. "I can only offer my apology and the assurance that our agreement stands. 3 months, at the end of which you may decide whether to proceed or to end our engagement with your reputation intact." Helen studied him, trying to reconcile the controlling man who had announced their engagement without her consent with this surprisingly vulnerable figure beside her. "And if I choose to end it, what will you tell society? That I proved unworthy of your affection, that the fault lies entirely with me?" His gaze was steady. "I give you my word." Before Helen could respond, they were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. A severe-looking man in formal attire appeared on the path. "Forgive the interruption, Your Grace, but an urgent message has arrived from London. It concerns the Harrington investments." Vincent's expression immediately transformed, the vulnerability vanishing behind the mask of the calculated businessman. "I'll attend to it directly, Simmons." He turned to Helen with a bow. "Please excuse me, Lady Helen. Duty calls." As he strode away, Helen remained on the bench, contemplating the puzzle that was Vincent Hastings. Which was the true man? The ruthless duke of reputation, the impulsive suitor who had claimed her at the ball, or the surprisingly thoughtful companion of this afternoon? And more troubling still, why did she find herself increasingly drawn to discovering the answer? 1 month later. "I absolutely refuse to discuss this matter further," Vincent's voice carried from behind the closed door of his study. "My decision is final." Helen paused in the corridor, hesitant to intrude on what was clearly a tense conversation. She had arrived at Greystone Abbey that morning for a week-long visit, accompanied by her mother as propriety demanded. After settling in, she had sought out Vincent to discuss the upcoming dinner with the local gentry, their first public appearance as an engaged couple in Hampshire society. "You cannot be serious about this marriage," came another voice, female, cultured, and unmistakably Lady Sophia's. "Think of your position, your reputation." Helen knew she should withdraw, but found herself rooted to the spot. "My position and reputation are precisely why I make my own choices in this matter," Vincent replied, his tone cooling further. "I neither seek nor require your approval, Sophia. But she is all wrong for you. Too plump, too opinionated, too ordinary. What will people say? They will say that the Duke of Ashbourne chose a woman of intelligence and character, rather than an empty-headed society puppet." A sound of frustration from Lady Sophia. "This is about your father, isn't it? This ridiculous rebellion against everything he valued." "Enough!" Vincent's voice cracked like a whip. "My father's values brought nothing but misery to all who depended on him, including my mother. I'll thank you not to invoke his memory in my house." "Vincent, please." Lady Sophia's tone softened to a honeyed plea. We have known each other since childhood. Everyone has always expected that we would eventually— Your expectations are not my obligation, Vincent interrupted. Now, I believe this conversation is concluded. Helen hastily retreated several steps before the door opened. Lady Sophia emerged, her perfect features flushed with anger. She froze when she spotted Helen. "Eavesdropping, Lady Helen? How appropriate for a future duchess." Her voice dripped with disdain. Before Helen could respond, Vincent appeared behind Sophia. His expression shifted subtly when he saw Helen, the cold mask softening into something warmer. "Helen," he stepped forward, deliberately placing himself between the two women. "I wasn't aware you had arrived. I trust your journey was pleasant." "Quite pleasant, thank you," Helen replied evenly, refusing to be provoked by Lady Sophia's accusation. "Mother and I have just settled in." "Splendid." "Lady Sophia was just leaving," Vincent said pointedly. Sophia's mouth tightened, but she managed a brittle smile. "Indeed I was. Do enjoy your rustic celebration with the local gentry." She directed a final barbed glance at Helen. "So fitting for your future duchess to practice with the minor nobility before attempting to manage London society." With that parting shot, she swept down the corridor, her expensive silk rustling with each angry step. Vincent waited until she had disappeared around the corner before turning to Helen with a sigh. "I apologize for that unpleasantness. Sophia has difficulty accepting situations that don't conform to her expectations." "So I gathered," Helen replied, studying him. The strain around his eyes spoke of deeper tensions than a mere social disagreement. "Are you quite all right, Vincent?" He seemed startled by the question. "I'm perfectly fine. Why do you ask?" "Because you look like a man who has been fighting battles on multiple fronts," she said frankly. "And because I couldn't help but overhear part of your conversation." At his raised eyebrow she added, "Not deliberately, I assure you, but Lady Sophia's voice carries remarkably well when she's agitated." A reluctant smile tugged at his mouth. "Indeed it does." He glanced at the still open door of his study. "Would you care to join me for tea? I find myself in need of more pleasant company." The study reflected Vincent's character in its appointments, elegant but not ostentatious, with well-worn leather chairs and bookshelves that showed signs of frequent use. As a footman brought tea, Helen settled into one of the comfortable chairs by the fireplace. "You mentioned battles on multiple fronts," Vincent said after dismissing the servant. "Your perception is accurate as usual. The Harrington investments I was called away to address during your last visit have proven more complicated than anticipated." "Is it serious?" Helen asked, accepting the cup he offered her. Vincent hesitated, seeming to weigh how much to reveal. "Potentially. A shipment of goods has been seized in Portsmouth on allegations of improper documentation. I suspect interference from a business rival rather than any actual impropriety." "Could this rival be attempting to damage your reputation before the wedding?" Helen ventured. His eyes sharpened with interest. "What makes you suggest that?" Helen set down her teacup. "In the past month, our engagement has been the subject of considerable speculation. If someone wished to break the match, creating financial difficulties or scandal would be an effective strategy." "You have a remarkably strategic mind, Lady Helen," Vincent said with genuine admiration. "The thought had occurred to me as well. There are several parties who might benefit from damaging my standing, either personally or professionally." "Including Lady Sophia?" The question slipped out before Helen could consider its wisdom. Vincent's expression darkened. "Sophia is many things, but I don't believe she would sink to industrial sabotage. Her weapons are social, not financial." He paused, studying Helen thoughtfully. "You seem remarkably untroubled by her hostility toward you." Helen shrugged. "I have never been society's darling. Disapproval is not a new experience." She met his gaze steadily. "Though I will admit it is novel to be disliked for supposedly securing a match rather than for failing to do so." Her dry observation startled a genuine laugh from Vincent, a warm, rich sound she had rarely heard from him. "You continue to surprise me, Helen Ashford." "Good," she replied with unexpected boldness. "I should hate to become predictable." His grey eyes warmed. "I think there is little danger of that." The companionable moment was interrupted by a knock at the study door. Vincent's expression immediately composed itself into its usual reserved mask. "Enter," he called. Mrs. Harrington appeared with a curtsy. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Grace. But Lady Westbrook is asking for Lady Helen. Something about final fittings for new gowns. Helen sighed. Her mother had insisted on commissioning an entirely new wardrobe for her, appropriate for her future station as a duchess. The endless fittings had become a trial of patience. Please inform Lady Westbrook that I shall join her directly, Helen said, rising reluctantly. Vincent stood as well. Before you go, might I request your company for a ride tomorrow morning? There are aspects of the estate I'd like to show you. I would enjoy that, Helen replied, surprised by the genuine regret she felt at ending their conversation. As she followed Mrs. Harrington from the study, Helen found herself reflecting on the changes of the past month. The strangeness of their arrangement had gradually given way to something that, while still complex, increasingly resembled a genuine courtship. Vincent had proved to be a considerate, if sometimes distant, fiancé. Their conversations had deepened beyond polite social exchanges into discussions of literature, politics, and philosophy, areas where Helen's unconventional education had prepared her well. She had discovered in him a sharp intelligence and unexpected flashes of humor beneath the controlled exterior. Yet questions remained. The conversation she had overheard revealed depths of conflict in Vincent's past that she had only glimpsed before. References to his father and the implication of family discord suggested wounds that Vincent kept carefully concealed. The following morning dawned clear and mild, perfect for riding. Helen wore her new riding habit of deep forest green, which her mother had insisted was more befitting a future duchess than her old navy blue ensemble. As she descended to the entrance hall, she found Vincent waiting, dressed in riding attire that emphasized his athletic build. "So you look remarkable, Lady Helen," he said, his admiration appearing entirely genuine. "Green suits you exceedingly well." "Thank you," she replied, pleased despite herself. "Mother insisted on the new color. She has become quite determined that I should look the part of a duchess." "You require no artificial enhancement to do so," Vincent said, offering his arm to escort her outside. "Your natural dignity would suit any station." The horses awaited them in the courtyard, a spirited chestnut gelding for Vincent and a gentle bay mare for Helen. "I took the liberty of selecting Persephone for you," Vincent said, as a groom helped Helen mount. "She has a mild temperament, but enjoys a good gallop when given the opportunity." "Much like myself," Helen observed with a smile, settling into the side saddle. "Mild-mannered until provoked." Vincent's eyes crinkled with amusement as he swung up onto his own mount. An apt comparison. "Shall we?" They rode at a leisurely pace through the estate's extensive grounds. Vincent proved to be a knowledgeable guide, pointing out various features of the land and explaining innovations he had implemented in farming practices. The previous method of crop rotation was woefully outdated, he explained as they passed a field where workers were busy with early summer planting. "By introducing new techniques and investing in proper drainage, we've increased yields by nearly 30%. Helen listened with genuine interest. "Your tenants must appreciate such improvements. Many landowners resist change, even when it would benefit everyone involved." Vincent's expression grew thoughtful. "My father was one such landowner. He believed that tradition should be maintained at all costs, regardless of its effectiveness." He guided his horse around a fallen branch. "When I inherited, many of the estate villages were in deplorable condition. Implementing changes has not always been easy. People resist disruption to familiar patterns, even harmful ones, but the results speak for themselves." "You care about their welfare," Helen observed. "That contradicts your reputation in London." Vincent's lips quirked in a humorless smile. "The ruthless Duke makes shrewd business decisions that increase his already substantial fortune. That is what society sees and reports. They rarely look beyond the surface to question how those profits are employed." They crested a small hill, and Vincent reined in his mount. Below them spread a neat village of stone cottages surrounding a small green. A new schoolhouse stood at one end, its slate roof gleaming in the morning sun. "Ashbourne Village," Vincent explained. "We've rebuilt most of the cottages over the past 5 years, adding proper ventilation and sanitation. The schoolhouse was completed last autumn. All children of the estate receive education until the age of 12, regardless of their parents' station." Helen studied him with new understanding. "This is where your shipping profits go." He nodded, a hint of vulnerability crossing his features before being carefully masked. "My mother," suffered greatly from my father's indifference to the welfare of those dependent on him. I swore that when the estate came into my hands, things would be different. The personal admission hung between them, significant in its rarity. Helen sensed there was much more to the story, but knew better than to press. "It's admirable work," she said simply. "Would you show me the village more closely? I should like to see the schoolhouse in particular." Relief flickered across Vincent's face at her acceptance without further questioning. Of course. Their arrival in the village caused a stir. Workers tipped their caps respectfully to the Duke, while women curtsied and children stared with wide eyes. To Helen's surprise, Vincent greeted many by name, inquiring after family members and stopping to discuss specific concerns with several of the older men. The schoolmaster, a young man with intelligent eyes and an earnest demeanor, showed them around the schoolhouse with evident pride. "We have 43 pupils at present, Your Grace, Lady Helen," he explained. "The additional slates you authorized have made a significant difference in our mathematics instruction." "Excellent," Vincent nodded. "And the library books I ordered from London?" "Arrived last week, sir. The children are particularly fond of the illustrated natural history volumes." As they took their leave, Helen noticed a small girl hovering nearby, clutching something in her hands and looking uncertain. "Hello there," Helen said gently, dropping to the child's level despite the constraints of her riding habit. "What's your name?" "Lily, milady," the girl answered shyly. "Lily Cooper. That's a lovely name," Helen smiled. "Do you attend school here?" The girl nodded, then thrust forward what she was holding, a small posy of wildflowers. "These are for you, milady. Dar says you're to be the new Duchess, and will look after us like His Grace does." Touched, Helen accepted the simple bouquet. "Thank you, Lily. That's very kind of you." Vincent, who had been speaking with the schoolmaster, turned at this exchange. Something in his expression softened as he observed Helen with the child. "Miss Cooper gives you high praise indeed," he said, as they remounted their horses to continue their ride. "Her father is one of my most trusted tenant farmers." Helen twirled the small bouquet between her fingers. "The entire village seems to hold you in high esteem. It's quite at odds with how you're perceived in London." "London sees what I choose to show it," Vincent replied. "I find it simpler to keep certain aspects of my life separate from society's prying eyes." "Including your charitable works?" "Especially those," he confirmed. "Genuine good is best done quietly, without expectation of praise or advantage." They rode in contemplative silence until they reached a small hill crowned by an ancient oak tree. Vincent suggested they dismount and rest the horses before returning to the house. Spread beneath the tree's sprawling canopy was a blanket and a picnic hamper, clearly arranged in advance. "You planned this," Helen said, pleasantly surprised. "Guilty as charged," Vincent admitted, helping her dismount. "I thought you might appreciate refreshment after our ride." The simple meal of cold chicken, fresh bread, and early strawberries tasted extraordinarily good in the open air. Helen found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did in formal settings, leaning back against the trunk of the great oak and admiring the view of Greystone Abbey in the distance. "It truly is beautiful here," she mused. "So different from London." Vincent, sitting beside her, followed her gaze. "I've always found more peace here than anywhere else. London is a necessary evil for business, but this," he gestured to the rolling countryside, "this is home." "You speak of London society with such disdain," Helen observed, "yet you move within it with apparent ease." Vincent was quiet for a moment, idly turning a strawberry between his fingers. "We all wear masks, Lady Helen. Some of us simply become more adept at it than others. And which is the mask? The ruthless Duke of London or the compassionate landlord of Hampshire?" His grey eyes met hers with unexpected directness. "Perhaps both are aspects of the same man, neither wholly false nor completely true." The honesty of his answer stirred something in Helen. "I believe I prefer the Hampshire version, though I suspect both are necessary in their proper contexts." "And what of you?" Vincent asked, his voice softening. "What masks do you wear, Lady Helen Ashford?" The question caught her off guard. I'm not certain I understand. Don't you?" His gaze was gentle but perceptive. The dutiful daughter who endures London seasons, despite knowing she doesn't fit society's mold. The accomplished, educated woman who pretends to care about embroidery and gossip to please her mother. The fiancé who agreed to maintain our charade out of concern for her family's feelings rather than her own desires. Helen felt unexpectedly exposed, as though he had seen through carefully constructed defenses she hadn't even realized she maintained. "You see a great deal," she said quietly. "I recognize familiar patterns," Vincent replied. "We are not so very different, you and I." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves above them, creating a dappled pattern of sunlight and shadow across the blanket. In this peaceful moment, removed from the constraints and expectations of society, Helen found herself studying Vincent with new eyes. The severe lines of his face had softened, and she could see both the man he was and the boy he might once have been, before life had taught him to guard himself so carefully. "The 3-month agreement," she said suddenly. "Does it still stand?" Vincent stiffened slightly. "Of course, I gave my word." "And if—" Helen hesitated, gathering her courage. "If at the end of that time I were to decide that I wished the engagement to continue, not as a charade but in truth, what would you say?" The question hung in the air between them, more revealing than any declaration. Vincent's eyes widened fractionally before his composure returned. "I would say," he replied carefully, "that I would consider myself fortunate beyond measure." "Would you?" Helen pressed, needing more than a polite response. "Or would you merely be honoring an obligation created by your own impulsive announcement?" Vincent moved closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Helen," he said, using her given name without the formal title for the first time, "whatever impulse led me to claim you that night, I have not regretted a single day of our engagement. Quite the contrary. Each conversation, each glimpse of your mind and spirit, has only confirmed what I somehow sensed from the beginning, that you are extraordinary in ways that have nothing to do with society's shallow measures of worth." The intensity of his words stole Helen's breath. "I'm beginning to think," she said softly, "that the Duke of Ashbourne is a far more romantic figure than his reputation suggests." A smile, a true, unguarded smile, transformed Vincent's face, only with the right inspiration. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Vincent's gaze dropped briefly to her lips, and Helen felt a flutter of anticipation. But before he could act on the impulse, the distant sound of hoofbeats interrupted the moment. A rider approached at speed, one of Vincent's grooms, his expression urgent. "Your Grace," he called, reining in his lathered mount. "Begging your pardon, but you're needed at the house immediately. Mr. Simmons says it's most urgent. Something about the Portsmouth shipment and allegations in the newspapers." Vincent's expression instantly transformed back into the controlled mask of the Duke. "What allegations?" "I don't know the particulars, sir, but Mr. Simmons says there are reporters from London asking questions, and Lady Sophia has arrived with her mother, insisting on speaking with you." Helen saw Vincent's jaw tighten. "Tell Simmons I'll be there directly." As the groom galloped back toward the house, Vincent turned to Helen with regret in his eyes. "I must deal with this. Would you mind if—" "Go," Helen said firmly. "I can find my own way back. This clearly requires your immediate attention." Vincent hesitated. "Helen, whatever you may hear, we shall discuss it later," she assured him. "Some battles must be fought alone first." "I understand." Gratitude flashed in his eyes. He bowed over her hand, pressing a brief, unexpected kiss to her fingers, before mounting his horse and riding swiftly toward the house. Helen gathered the remains of their picnic at a more leisurely pace, her thoughts whirling. The peaceful interlude had revealed more of Vincent's true character than weeks of formal interaction. Yet now some new crisis threatened to intrude upon their growing understanding. As she rode back to Greystone Abbey, Helen couldn't help but wonder what fresh challenge awaited them there, and whether their fragile new connection would withstand the storm. The scene that greeted Helen upon her return to Greystone Abbey was one of barely contained chaos. Servants hurried through the halls with worried expressions, and raised voices could be heard from Vincent's study. Her mother intercepted her in the entrance hall, her normally composed features pinched with concern. "Helen, there you are. What is happening? The house is in absolute uproar, and Lady Sophia arrived in a state of high agitation, saying something about a scandal in the newspapers." "I know as little as you do, Mother," Helen replied, handing her riding crop and gloves to a waiting footman. Vincent was called away urgently, but he didn't have time to explain the details. Lady Westbrook lowered her voice. "There are reporters from London newspapers in the village. asking most impertinent questions about the Duke's business dealings and, she glanced around before continuing, and the nature of your engagement. Helen felt a cold knot form in her stomach. I see. Where is Vincent now? In his study with Mr. Simmons and some other gentlemen. Lady Sophia and her mother, Lady Catherine, are waiting in the blue drawing room. They've been asking to speak with you. Helen straightened her shoulders. Then I shall oblige them. But first I need to change from my riding clothes. In her chambers, Clara helped her change swiftly into a day dress of deep blue silk, one of her new gowns, chosen specifically because the colour lent her a certain dignity. There's all manner of gossip below stairs, milady, Clara reported, as she fastened the tiny buttons at Helen's back. Something about smuggled goods and accusations in the papers, and that Lady Sophia arrived saying she knew this would happen, and that it's all connected to the engagement. Did she indeed? Helen's voice was calm, though her mind raced. How interesting. Miss Daniels, Lady Sophia's maid, is telling anyone who'll listen that her ladyship always expected the Duke would come to his senses and make a proper match once this temporary infatuation passed. Clara's indignation on Helen's behalf was evident in every syllable. I see. Helen studied her reflection as Clara arranged her hair. The woman who gazed back at her looked composed and dignified, every inch a future duchess. I believe it's time I had a frank conversation with Lady Sophia. The blue drawing room contained Lady Sophia and an older woman who could only be her mother, Lady Catherine Blackwood. Both women rose as Helen entered, their expressions a study in barely concealed satisfaction. Lady Helen, Lady Catherine inclined her head with minimal courtesy. How good of you to join us. I trust you are aware of the situation. I understand there is some concern regarding newspaper reports, Helen replied evenly, though I have not yet had the opportunity to learn the specifics. Allow me to enlighten you, Lady Sophia said with false sweetness. The London papers are reporting that Vincent's shipping company has been caught smuggling luxury goods to avoid import duties. The Portsmouth authorities have seized a shipment worth thousands of pounds, and there are suggestions that this practice has been ongoing for some time. Lady Catherine made a sound of distress. The Ashbourne name has never before been tainted by scandal. In my late husband's time as the Duke's guardian, such a thing would have been unthinkable. I find it equally unthinkable now, Helen said firmly. Vincent runs his business affairs with absolute integrity. Lady Sophia gave a delicate laugh. Your loyalty is touching, if misplaced. But you must understand, Lady Helen, that this situation changes everything. The scandal will be devastating unless managed properly. And you believe yourselves qualified to manage it? Helen asked, arching an eyebrow. We have been connected to the Ashbourne family for generations, Lady Catherine said stiffly. My husband was the late Duke's closest friend and Vincent's godfather. We understand what is at stake. Which is why, Lady Sophia added, leaning forward earnestly, we believe the most prudent course of action would be to announce the dissolution of your engagement immediately. Helen maintained her composure with effort. I fail to see how abandoning Vincent at the first sign of difficulty would improve matters. Lady Catherine's expression hardened. Be sensible, girl. Your hasty engagement was surprising enough when Vincent's reputation was unblemished. Now with scandal brewing, society will inevitably draw unfortunate conclusions about the nature of your connection. They will assume, Lady Sophia spelled out bluntly, that Vincent was entrapped into offering for you, perhaps through some impropriety, and that this business scandal is merely the first indication of his judgment being compromised. Or, Helen countered, they might conclude that in times of trouble true character reveals itself, both in those who stand firm and those who seek advantage from others' misfortunes. Lady Sophia flushed. You mistake our intentions. We care deeply for Vincent's welfare. So deeply that you arrived with remarkable speed to suggest I abandon him at the first hint of trouble. Helen shook her head. Forgive me if I find your concern somewhat calculated. The door opened before either woman could respond, and Vincent entered the room. His face was grave, the strain of the past hours evident in the tightness around his eyes, but his bearing remained proudly erect. Ladies, he acknowledged them with a slight bow. I apologize for keeping you waiting. Lady Catherine rose immediately. Vincent, my dear boy, we came as soon as we heard. This dreadful business is being addressed, Vincent finished firmly. The allegations are false, as I will shortly prove. Of course they are, Lady Sophia said soothingly, moving to his side and placing a hand on his arm. But the damage to your reputation in the meantime. We've been discussing with Lady Helen the wisdom of postponing the wedding until this matter is resolved. Vincent's gaze shifted to Helen, a question in his eyes. Actually, Helen said calmly, Lady Sophia was suggesting that breaking the engagement entirely would be the most prudent course. I was explaining why I disagree. Vincent gently but firmly removed Lady Sophia's hand from his arm. I see. His voice was cool. I appreciate your concern, but my personal affairs are not open for committee discussion. Vincent, Lady Catherine protested, you must think of the Ashbourne name, of your position in society. A scandal of this nature will be addressed directly and decisively, Vincent interrupted. The facts will speak for themselves once they are brought to light. He moved to stand beside Helen. As for my engagement, it stands. Indeed, Lady Helen and I were discussing this very morning the possibility of moving the wedding date forward rather than postponing it. Helen managed to hide her surprise at this unexpected declaration. They had discussed no such thing, but she understood immediately what Vincent was doing, asserting control of the narrative and denying his detractors the satisfaction of seeing his personal life disrupted by their machinations. How impulsive, Lady Sophia said, her voice strained. One might almost wonder if there are additional reasons for such haste. The only reason, Vincent replied with deliberate emphasis, is that I see no purpose in delay when my mind is quite decided. He placed his hand over Helen's where it rested on the back of a nearby chair. Now, if you'll excuse us, I need to speak privately with my fiancé. Lady Catherine drew herself up with wounded dignity. I see our concern is unwelcome. Come, Sophia. We shall return to London immediately. You're welcome to stay the night, Vincent offered with perfect courtesy, though his tone suggested he expected, and preferred, refusal. No, I think not, Lady Sophia replied tightly. Clearly our presence is superfluous now that you have such a steadfast supporter in Lady Helen. After they had departed, Vincent led Helen to his study, dismissing the servants with instructions not to disturb them unless absolutely necessary. Once they were alone, he sank into a chair with a weary sigh, the carefully maintained facade cracking to reveal genuine exhaustion. I apologize for involving you further in this mess, he said, rubbing a hand across his face, and for the presumption of announcing plans to advance our wedding without consulting you. It seemed the most effective way to silence their immediate interference. It was, Helen agreed, taking the seat opposite him. Now, tell me the truth of this situation. What exactly is happening? Vincent studied her for a moment as if assessing how much to reveal. Then, apparently deciding on complete candor, he explained, the Portsmouth shipment contains French silks and other luxury goods. The documentation is entirely in order, with all appropriate duties paid. However, someone has bribed officials to claim irregularities and has simultaneously planted stories in the newspapers suggesting smuggling and tax evasion. Who would do such a thing? Helen asked. I have my suspicions, Vincent replied grimly. Lord Richard Harrington, a business rival who has opposed me in several recent ventures, stands to benefit considerably if my reputation is damaged. The timing is particularly suspicious, as I'm currently negotiating to purchase controlling interest in a shipping line he has also been pursuing. You mentioned this Harrington investment before, Helen recalled. Could Lady Sophia or her mother be involved as well? Vincent hesitated. I would not have thought them capable of industrial sabotage. Social manipulation is more their style. But the coincidence troubles me. They appeared remarkably quickly after the news broke. As if they were anticipating it, Helen suggested. Precisely. Vincent leaned forward, his expression intent. The most damaging aspect of this situation is the speed with which the allegations have spread. Someone ensured that the newspapers received anonymous information simultaneously with the seizure of the goods. What will you do? I've sent my solicitor to Portsmouth with all the original documentation proving the legality of the shipment. My agent in London is speaking with the newspaper editors, demanding retractions, and I've dispatched letters to my most important business associates assuring them of the falsehood of these claims. Helen considered this information carefully. You need to address the source as well as the symptoms. If Lord Harrington is indeed behind this, he must be dealt with directly. Vincent's eyebrows rose slightly at her strategic thinking. Yes, but carefully. Accusing a peer of the realm of criminal actions without incontrovertible proof would only worsen the situation. Then we must obtain such proof, Helen said simply. Who handles Lord Harrington's shipping arrangements? Who might have access to his correspondence? Every conspiracy requires multiple participants, and not all will be equally loyal or discreet. A slow smile spread across Vincent's face. Helen Ashford, you have a positively devious mind beneath that proper exterior. I prefer to think of it as practical, she replied with a small smile of her own. Now, about this accelerated wedding date. Was that merely a stratagem to thwart Lady Sophia, or did you mean it? Vincent's expression grew serious. It was a tactical response in the moment, but he rose and came to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. If you would consider it, not out of obligation or to counter this scandal, but because you wish it, I would be honored to make you my Duchess sooner rather than later. The sincerity in his eyes took Helen's breath away. This was no longer the calculated arrangement they had begun with, but something far more meaningful. What of our 3-month agreement? She asked softly. You promised me time to decide. And I stand by that promise, Vincent replied. If you wish to wait, we shall wait. I would not have you rush into a decision of such magnitude without complete certainty. Helen studied their joined hands, his strong and steady around her smaller ones. And what of the scandal? Won't it reflect poorly on me to marry a man under such a cloud, however unjustly it formed? That is precisely why I would release you from any obligation if you wished it, Vincent said gravely. I would not have your reputation tarnished by association with mine. My reputation, Helen replied with unexpected firmness, is my own to risk, and I find I have developed a rather strong aversion to allowing others to dictate the course of my life based on their narrow definitions of propriety. Hope flickered in Vincent's eyes. Does that mean— It means, Helen interrupted gently, that I have no intention of abandoning you to face this alone. As for hastening the wedding, she paused, considering her words carefully. I believe we should resolve the immediate crisis before making such a decision, not out of doubt or hesitation, but because I would have our wedding day unclouded by scandal or speculation. Vincent raised her hands to his lips, pressing a fervent kiss to her fingers. You continue to astonish me, Helen Ashford. When I made that impulsive announcement at Pemberton Palace, I could not have imagined finding a woman of such strength and character. Nor could I have imagined finding a man whose public mask concealed such depth and integrity, Helen replied softly. For a moment, they remained thus, connected by joined hands and newfound understanding. Then Vincent rose, his expression shifting back to determination. We have work to do, he said, the Duke once more though with a new warmth in his eyes. If you're to stand with me in this battle, you should know all the details. Over the next hour, Vincent shared every aspect of the situation with Helen, valuing her insights and suggestions. Together, they crafted a strategy to counter the allegations and identify the true culprits. By the time they emerged from the study, a plan was in place, one that would require both Vincent's business acumen and Helen's social intelligence to execute successfully. The following days passed in a flurry of activity. Vincent travelled briefly to London and Portsmouth to address the business aspects directly, while Helen managed affairs at Greystone Abbey, receiving visitors with calm dignity and neither confirming nor denying the various rumours that circulated. When Lady Caroline expressed concern about the potential scandal affecting Helen's reputation, her daughter surprised her with her resolute response. If I were to abandon Vincent at the first sign of trouble, Helen said firmly, what would that say about my character? What kind of duchess would I be if I valued social approval above loyalty and justice? But darling, her mother protested weakly, your future position will be what I make of it, Helen interrupted gently. Vincent has shown me that titles and wealth mean nothing without integrity to guide their use. I would rather be the wife of a good man under a cloud of false accusations than the pampered ornament of a man with no substance. Lady Caroline studied her daughter with new eyes. You love him, she said, wonder in her voice. This began as such a strange arrangement, but you've actually fallen in love with him. Helen felt a flush rise to her cheeks. I admire him greatly, she admitted. His public persona conceals a man of remarkable principles and compassion. And he cares for you as well, her mother observed shrewdly. I've seen how he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. Whatever peculiar circumstances brought you together, I believe you may have found something genuine amid the artifice. Vincent returned from London 3 days later with an expression of grim satisfaction. He sought Helen immediately, finding her in the library where she was composing correspondence. "We have him," Vincent announced without preamble. Harrington's clerk came forward with evidence. Apparently his conscience couldn't bear the weight of the deception any longer. Helen set aside her pen, relief washing over her. What exactly did he reveal? Letters in Harrington's hand, instructing the bribery of customs officials and the placement of false stories in the newspapers. But more interestingly, Vincent's expression darkened. Correspondence between Harrington and Lady Catherine Blackwood, discussing how best to create a scandal that would force me to reconsider certain personal decisions. They were working together, Helen said, the pieces falling into place. Lady Catherine saw an opportunity to secure your marriage to Sophia by discrediting you and making me appear a liability. Precisely. Though Harrington's primary motivation was financial, Lady Catherine's was entirely personal. She has apparently harbored hopes of joining our families since Sophia was in the cradle. What will happen now? The newspapers will print retractions tomorrow. The customs officials involved have been dismissed and may face charges. As for Harrington, Vincent's mouth set in a grim line. He faces financial ruin. Several of his investors have withdrawn their support in light of his actions. And Lady Catherine and Sophia will find themselves notably absent from society's most exclusive gatherings for the foreseeable future. And us? Helen asked softly. What of us, Vincent? He crossed the room to her side, taking her hands and drawing her to her feet. That depends entirely on what you want, Helen. Our 3-month agreement still stands if you wish it. Or, she prompted when he hesitated. Or you could agree to marry me in truth, not as part of a charade or arrangement, but because, against all expectations, we have found in each other something genuine and valuable. Helen studied his face, the face that had become so dear to her over these past weeks. The stern lines had softened when he looked at her, the grey eyes warm with an emotion she had come to recognize as love. When you announced our engagement at Pemberton Palace, she said carefully, I thought it the most mortifying moment of my life. I was certain you were mocking me, the plain, overlooked daughter of an earl, suddenly claimed by the most eligible duke in England. Vincent winced. It was unconscionable of me. I acted on impulse without... Helen placed her fingers gently against his lips, silencing him. Let me finish. What began as mortification became confusion, then curiosity, then admiration. I discovered a man beneath the title, a man of principle and depth, who cares for those dependent on him and strives to use his privilege for good rather than mere self-aggrandizement. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. Somewhere along the way, admiration became something more. I found myself looking forward to your letters, treasuring our conversations, thinking of you when we were apart. So yes, Vincent Hastings, I will marry you, not because of a rash announcement at a ball or to satisfy society's expectations, but because I love you. Joy transformed Vincent's face, making him look younger and more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. He drew her close, his arms encircling her with gentle reverence. I love you, Helen Ashford, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I think perhaps I began to fall in love with you that very first night, when you looked at me not as the Duke of Ashbourne, but simply as a man, and found me wanting. Helen laughed softly. I found you intimidating and presumptuous. As I said, wanting, Vincent smiled, but you challenged me to be better, to be worthy of the woman you are, rather than the Duchess society expected. And you showed me that I need not conform to society's narrow definitions of worth to be valued, Helen replied. That my mind and heart mattered more than my appearance or accomplishments. Vincent cradled her face between his hands, his gaze tender. You are beautiful, Helen. Not by society's artificial standards, perhaps, but in all the ways that truly matter. Your kindness to that child in the village, your strategic thinking in the face of crisis, your loyalty when it would have been easier to abandon me, these are the qualities of true beauty. He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. But Helen raised her face to his, and their lips met in a first kiss that held both tenderness and promise. When they finally parted, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "I believe we have scandalized the servants quite thoroughly," he murmured, a smile in his voice. "Good practice for scandalizing society, I suppose," Helen replied with newfound boldness. "After all, they still won't understand what the Duke of Ashbourne sees in plain Lady Helen Ashford." Vincent's arms tightened around her. "Then we shall simply have to show them, my love, day by day, year by year, until even the most obtuse observer recognizes what I already know, that you are the most remarkable woman in England, and I the most fortunate of men to have won your heart." 6 months later. The grand winter ball at Pemberton Palace sparkled with the light of 1,000 candles, just as it had on that fateful spring evening when a dance had changed 2 lives forever. But this time, Helen entered the ballroom not as an overlooked wallflower, but as Her Grace the Duchess of Ashbourne on the arm of her husband. She felt the weight of curious glances, heard the whispers behind fans and gloved hands. Despite the vindication of Vincent's business affairs and their apparently happy marriage, society still wondered at the match, the severe Duke and his unconventional Duchess. Lady Sophia stood across the room, her beauty as striking as ever, but her expression sour as she watched them. Beside her, her mother maintained a rigid dignity, though both women had lost considerable social standing when their plot with Lord Harrington had been exposed. "She still resents me," Helen observed quietly to Vincent. "And will likely continue to do so indefinitely," he replied, unconcerned. "Though her prospects have improved recently, I hear Lord Fairchild's son has begun to pay her marked attention." "The same Lord Fairchild's son my mother once hoped would notice me," Helen noted with ironic amusement. "Life takes unexpected turns, does it not?" Vincent's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, his touch warm and reassuring. "The best turns are the ones we never see coming." The orchestra began the opening notes of a waltz, the same waltz they had danced to all those months ago. Vincent turned to Helen with a formal bow, though his eyes danced with private mischief. "One waltz with me, Duchess," he said with deliberate echo of that first night, "and you'll be my wife." Helen laughed, the sound bright and unrestrained. "I believe that particular bargain has already been fulfilled, Your Grace." "So it has," Vincent agreed, leading her onto the dance floor, "though I find myself wishing to renew it daily for the rest of our lives." As they moved in perfect harmony across the ballroom, Helen reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a jest that wasn't truly a jest, through misunderstanding and revelation, to a love neither had expected to find. Each step had been necessary, each challenge overcome had strengthened the bond between them. "What are you thinking, my love?" Vincent asked softly as he guided her through a turn. Helen smiled up at him, no longer the uncertain woman who had once feared she would never find acceptance. "I'm thinking that some games, when played with the right partner, can lead to the most unexpected victories." Vincent's eyes warmed with understanding and love, and some declarations, even when made impulsively, can reveal truths we hadn't yet acknowledged to ourselves. As they continued their dance, observed by all of society, Helen felt none of the self-consciousness that had plagued her throughout previous seasons. The weight of others' opinions had lightened, replaced by the certainty of her own worth, and of Vincent's unwavering regard. "The Countess of Elderwood is practically vibrating with curiosity," Vincent murmured, nodding subtly toward a formidable matron, watching them intently. "She cornered me earlier to express her astonishment at how well our match has turned out." "How generous of her," Helen replied dryly. "And what did you tell her?" "That I consider myself the most fortunate man in England to have secured a wife of such intelligence, character, and beauty, and that if society cannot recognize your value, it merely confirms my low opinion of society's discernment." Helen felt a flush of pleasure at his words. "You didn't." "I most certainly did," Vincent affirmed with a hint of the stern Duke that had once intimidated all of London. "It's time society adjusted its narrow definitions rather than expecting exceptional women to diminish themselves to fit arbitrary molds." The music drew to a close and Vincent led Helen from the dance floor. As they moved through the crowd, Helen caught fragments of conversation, speculation about her gown, commissioned from Paris, her jewellery — Vincent had gifted her the Ashbourne sapphires — and whether her figure had changed in a way that might suggest an heir was forthcoming, it had not, though not for lack of mutual desire for a family. "Shall we silence the gossips once more?" Vincent asked, a gleam of mischief in his eyes as they reached a relatively quiet corner. "What did you have in mind?" Helen asked, recognizing the expression that still occasionally took her by surprise, the playful side of her husband that so few were privileged to witness. In answer, Vincent drew her into a modest but unmistakable embrace, pressing a brief kiss to her forehead with obvious affection. Around them, conversations faltered as society registered this public display of genuine attachment between the Duke and his unconventional Duchess. "Shocking," Helen murmured, though her eyes danced with amusement. "What will people say?" "That the Duke of Ashbourne is clearly besotted with his wife," Vincent replied, unrepentant. "And they would be entirely correct." Later that evening, as their carriage carried them back to Ashbourne House, their London residence, Helen leaned against Vincent's shoulder in comfortable familiarity. "I received a letter from Clara today," she said, referring to her former lady's maid who had recently married the schoolmaster from the village near Greystone Abbey. "The new addition to the schoolhouse is nearly complete. The children are thrilled with the prospect of a proper library room." "Excellent," Vincent nodded with satisfaction. "And the clinic in the village? Dr. Bennet reports that the new medicines have arrived from London. He believes the fever that troubled the Harper family's youngest child has finally broken." Vincent covered her hand with his, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "You've transformed Ashbourne Village in just 6 months. The tenants speak of you with such admiration." "I've merely built upon the foundation you established," Helen demurred, "though I must admit I find the work deeply satisfying, far more so than planning elaborate dinner parties or making social calls." "Yet you manage those duties with remarkable grace as well," Vincent observed. "The diplomatic way you handled the ambassador's wife last week was nothing short of masterful." Helen smiled at the memory. "She reminded me of Lady Sophia, all polished exterior concealing a rather barbed interior. Once you learn to recognize the type, they become easier to manage." The carriage turned onto the quiet street where Ashbourne House stood, its windows glowing with welcoming light. As they approached, Helen reflected on how completely her life had changed since that spring evening, when a simple waltz had altered her destiny. "Happy?" Vincent asked softly, studying her contemplative expression. "Immensely," she replied without hesitation, "though sometimes I still find myself marveling at the strange path that brought us here. If you hadn't approached me that night, if I hadn't accepted your invitation to dance, if I hadn't made that impulsive announcement," Vincent added, a shadow of old regret crossing his features. Helen turned to face him fully. "I've never asked you directly what made you do it. What possessed you to announce our engagement before all of society when we had barely exchanged more than a dance?" Vincent was quiet for a moment, seeming to search for the right words. "There was a moment during our waltz," he finally said, "when you looked at me, not with the deference or calculation I was accustomed to, but with clear-eyed assessment. You saw me, Helen. Not the title, not the fortune, but the man beneath. And in that moment I realized how rare that was, how precious." His hand tightened around hers. "The announcement was impulsive, yes, but the impulse came from a recognition, perhaps not fully conscious even to myself, that I had found something unique and valuable that I was unwilling to relinquish." "Even though you barely knew me?" Helen asked, touched by his explanation but still wondering at the risk he had taken. "Even then," Vincent confirmed, "though I will admit I had no idea how completely my initial impression would be confirmed and exceeded as I came to know you truly." The carriage came to a stop before their home. Vincent helped Helen descend, but paused before they ascended the steps to the front door. "In business," he said thoughtfully, "I've often trusted my instincts. Those immediate impressions that arise before conscious thought has time to analyze, they've rarely led me astray." His eyes, warm in the light spilling from the house, met hers. "With you it was the same, an instinctive recognition that defied logical explanation but proved profoundly true." Helen smiled, reaching up to touch his cheek tenderly. "Then I'm grateful for your impulsiveness, Your Grace. It led to the happiest of outcomes, despite our rather unconventional beginning." "And you, my love?" Vincent asked as they climbed the steps together. "What made you stay when you could have cried off, claimed a misunderstanding, escaped the charade?" Helen considered this as they entered the warmth of their home. Curiosity at first, she admitted, as a footman took their outer garments. Then pride. I refused to be intimidated by Lady Sophia and her ilk. But then, she paused, searching for words to express the gradual transformation of her feelings. Then I began to see glimpses of the man behind the Duke. The way you knew the names of every tenant child. The books you chose as gifts, showing you'd actually listened to my interests rather than assuming what a lady should prefer. The respect with which you treated those in your employ. They ascended the grand staircase together, retiring to the private sitting room that connected their respective chambers, though in truth they rarely slept apart. By the time the scandal erupted, Helen continued as Vincent poured them each a small glass of sherry, I found I could no more abandon you than I could stop breathing, not out of obligation or propriety, but because my heart was already yours, though I scarcely recognized it myself. Vincent handed her a glass, his expression tender. We are quite the pair, aren't we? Both of us discovering our true feelings almost by accident, through a charade that became more genuine than either of us anticipated. Perhaps not so accidental, Helen mused, sipping her sherry thoughtfully. Perhaps some part of you recognized what you truly wanted that night at Pemberton Palace, and perhaps some part of me recognized it too when I accepted your invitation to dance despite all my reservations. Vincent set aside his glass and drew her into his arms. Whatever forces brought us together, impulse, fate, or hidden wisdom, we didn't recognize at the time. I thank heaven for them daily. As do I, Helen whispered, rising on tiptoes to meet his kiss. Later, as they lay in the peaceful darkness of their bedchamber, Vincent's arm curved protectively around her waist. Helen reflected on their extraordinary journey. From a reluctant charade to the deepest truth of her life, the love that had transformed her, from an overlooked wallflower to a woman who knew her own worth, independent of society's narrow judgments. Vincent, she murmured, uncertain if he had already drifted to sleep. Yes, my love. His voice was drowsy but attentive. Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you hadn't made that announcement? If we had simply danced and parted, returning to our separate lives? He was quiet for a moment, his hand drawing gentle circles on her arm. I suspect, he finally said, that I would have found some other way to pursue you. The announcement merely accelerated what I believe was inevitable. Inevitable? Helen smiled in the darkness. That seems rather confident, Your Grace. Not confidence, Vincent corrected softly. Faith. Some connections are too profound to be denied, regardless of the circumstances of their beginning. His arms tightened around her. Whether it took one dance or 100, I believe we would have found our way to each other. Helen nestled closer, her heart full. From a game to forever, she whispered. And I would play it again exactly the same way, Vincent replied, for it led me to you. Outside, snow began to fall over London, covering the city in a blanket of pristine white. But within the walls of Ashbourne House, the Duke and his Duchess lay wrapped in the warmth of a love that had begun with a simple waltz and a bold declaration, a love that would continue to deepen through all the seasons of their lives together. For what had started as just a game had become the most precious reality, a truth more beautiful and enduring than either could have imagined on that spring evening when a dance had changed their destinies forever. The end. Dear listener, as the final notes of our story fade like the last candles at Pemberton Palace, I invite you to linger a moment longer in this quiet space between tales. In Vincent and Helen's unexpected journey, perhaps you glimpsed something of your own path through life's grand ballroom. How many of us, in our 7th or 8th decade, still carry the weight of society's judgments from years past? Those whispers that once told us we were too much of this or too little of that, too plump, too outspoken, too cautious, too bold. Helen's transformation reminds us that it's never too late to shed the confining corsets of others' expectations. At 23, she discovered her worth beyond the measuring tape of Victorian society. At 60, 70, or beyond, we too can still surprise ourselves by stepping into new dances, by allowing ourselves the freedom of 2nd, 3rd, or 4th chapters. Vincent's discovery that the masks we've worn for decades can become so familiar we forget they are not our true face, speaks to those of us who've spent lifetimes perfecting our public performances. What courage it takes to set aside these comfortable disguises, to allow someone to see the vulnerability beneath our carefully constructed fortifications. Yet what freedom awaits in that tender unveiling? The silver threads now gracing your temples carry wisdom that your younger self could only imagine. Like the ancient oak that sheltered our lovers' picnic, you have weathered storms that once seemed unbearable, shed leaves you thought essential, and still stand, perhaps altered, but undefeated by time's passage. Tonight, as you settle into rest, may you release the weight of judgment, both from others and from that sometimes harsh voice within. Like the Duke's ancestral home transformed by Helen's presence, your years are not a burden, but a beautifully weathered estate, each crack and crease telling stories of resilience, of love both given and received, of battles fought and wisdom earned. Tomorrow, when dawn breaks, may you greet it with the quiet confidence of those who know that true value, like true love, only deepens with the passing seasons. Your hands may bear the marks of time, but they are all the more beautiful for the lives they've touched, the burdens they've carried, the joys they've celebrated. In a world that too often worships at the altar of youth, be like our Helen, standing firm in the knowledge that character, kindness, and authentic presence will always outshine the fleeting sparkle of artificial standards. Your worth was never found in fitting into society's narrow definitions, but in the unique melody you've contributed to life's grand orchestra. Sleep well tonight, wrapped in the assurance that your story, with all its unexpected turns and beautiful imperfections, is still unfolding, still worthy of being told, still captivating those fortunate enough to know its narrator. With profound gratitude, Legends of the Fall team. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this story. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave us a comment, and share it with someone you think would enjoy it too. We invite you to subscribe to our channel and help support our storytelling project, so we can continue crafting new tales full of love, redemption, and transformation. And don't forget, at the end of this video, another suggested story will appear. Click and be surprised by another unforgettable journey from the bottom of our hearts. Thank you.